Hello everyone. So I was getting pretty sick of the same tropes and misconceptions popping up again and again and again and being repeated without being checked, mostly by the alternative media. And so I decided to write a blog about this and basically examine some of these. The article is pretty long, and I know that basically a lot of people just can't be bothered to go through the effort of reading long articles. So I've got your back, I'm reading it for you. So again, you've got absolutely no excuse. The blog originally came out on Wednesday, the 13th of October 2021, and it's called COVID Misconceptions Debunked. Now, although I am going to read it out to you, what I would advise is that you have the actual article open because there's several pictures and graphs and things like that that illustrate the points that I'm making. COVID Misconceptions Debunked. The main problem with the alternative media's response to the COVID crisis was that they confused contrarianism with critical thinking. When it was announced in early 2020 that there was a pandemic, the alt media, en masse, simply took the stance, no there isn't. If the TV and the MSM News say that there is, then it stands to reason that the opposite is true. But this is not critical thinking. It's not even free thinking. It's a mantra. So, as the evidence stacked up that some sort of worldwide pandemic might be afoot, the alternative media doubled and tripled down, swearing blind that no such virus had been proven to exist, or that mainstays of medical procedure used for 30 years were now not fit for purpose, or that they knew of absolutely no one that had been affected by this so-called disease, and that the whole thing was pretty much a hoax. Some even went so far as to convince themselves that viruses themselves don't exist. Bless your heart. Some people took the other route, that the virus was a world-ending event, and many gleefully dusted off their prep bags from 2012, hoping against hope that the apocalypse would finally be with us. Then a new voice on the scene called Thomas Cowan suggested, with zero evidence, that 5G was deadly, and suddenly the alternative media had another suspect for any deaths or illnesses that might occur. Thomas Cowan had been suspended from his job as a doctor since 2017 when he prescribed an unlicensed medicine to a woman suffering from cancer, and this was without telling her that this product was not an approved medicine. He relinquished his license in 2020. Then he started selling alternative consultations for $375 a pop and became terrified of the coming upgrades to the phone system. He claimed that the 1918 Spanish flu was actually caused by the worldwide introduction of radio waves by commercial radio stations, and this was easily debunked as the first commercial radio began 2 years later in 1920. This 5G will kill us all was simply a retreading of the previous 4G will kill us all, which was a rerun of the old 3G will kill us all. This, in itself, was a reimagining of the 2G will kill us all theory, which was seeded by the mobile phones will kill us all theory, which came from the tetramasts will end all life on Earth theory, which was, in actuality, an extension of the all electricity lines will eventually push the entire planet off this mortal coil trope. Now, there are examples of people who are extremely sensitive to electronic devices. Yes, this is true, but that is very rare and not at all what this theory was about. Also, there are devices that do actually utilize 5G for weaponry. The most cited is the active denial system, which works like an invisible heat ray. It heats the skin, causing whoever falls in its path to retreat. However, this uses huge amounts of power and even still can't actively penetrate the skin. So comparing the phone system to these weapons is like comparing a matchstick to a flamethrower. Thomas Cowan claimed that Wuhan, the seeming start point of the outbreak, was the first city to ever have 5G. But this was also not true. Cities in the USA had 5G long before Wuhan. Also, places with no 5G network, such as Iran, Japan, and Malaysia, had large outbreaks of SARS-CoV-2. There wasn't even a correlation, let alone a potential connection. Misconceptions coloured the narrative. Since then, a series of misconceptions have plagued the alt media and tainted their understanding of current world events. They have coloured the narrative, that is to say, assumed something to be true and followed clues that seem to support this erroneous notion. So, what are these misconceptions? The virus doesn't exist and has never been proven to exist. SARS-CoV-2 has never fulfilled Koch's postulates. Viruses are actually exosomes. Viruses themselves don't exist. The PCR tests don't look for viruses. The inventor of the PCR tests said that they were not suitable for looking for disease of any kind. The tests give over 90% false positive results. SARS-CoV-2 was taken off the HSID register and therefore is of no significance. People are dying with the disease and not of it. The tests are run at too high a CT rate. Death certificates have been faked and death rates artificially inflated. FOIA requests show that the virus doesn't exist and that no one has a sample. It's just the flu. Asymptomatic spread is a myth. Masks don't work and can even be dangerous to the wearer. The virus has a 99.9% survival rate and not that many people have died. Every single one of those is false, completely false, utterly rubbish, and provably so. Now, it's perfectly okay to be wrong. You can't learn if you don't get stuff wrong first. But once you have new information, you should adapt and change your perspective based on this new understanding. The alternative media has clung slavishly to a whole raft of easily disprovable tropes. What they should do is reappraise their position, but they haven't. They just haven't bothered. These tropes form the foundation of the majority of the alt media's understanding of the current world events. But when your foundations aren't solid, your entire perspective becomes skewed. The line is often quoted as, "question everything." So can I just ask why that isn't being done? Now, before we start, do I think that COVID is a terrible world-ending event? No, but it isn't nothing. And pretending that it is nothing hasn't helped, and it won't help. You should be holding the government to account, and they're using this crisis to destroy and privatise the NHS, and denying the existence or potential consequences of this disease actually helps the government accomplish this, whilst insulating them from criticism for their failures. So let's question everything. So let's look at these misconceptions that have been clouding the judgment of the alternative media. But has it been isolated? Now, one of the silliest and easiest things to disprove that certain members of the alternative media are still clinging to is the idea that SARS-CoV-2 virus has never been isolated. What does this mean? Isolation is the process of culturing the virus on a host cell, then removing its genome to prove that you have a newly found entity. Spoilers! This has been done literally thousands of times. It was first done in Korea in early 2020, and since then by thousands of independent laboratories across the globe. Don't believe me? We'll simply go to Google Scholar and look up isolated SARS-CoV-2 and behold the many, many examples laid before you. Some say, well, when they are looking for it, they're just following the computer program that the Chinese told them was the virus. But that simply isn't how it works. Thousands of places have isolated the virus themselves completely independently of one another, and each time they find the exact same genetic material, proving that this is the same thing. Oh, by the way, here's the genome. And if you go to my website, you'll see the actual genome of SARS-CoV-2. The concept of the genome being faked somehow by the isolation process also falls flat, as they have extracted the virus from lung fluid and urine directly from a subject. Here is the isolate taken from lung fluid, and on my website it shows a picture of SARS-CoV-2 taken directly from lung fluid without spinning it down. Here are other examples of laboratories independently isolating the virus, and if you go to my website, there's examples of various laboratories across the globe, including Korea, China, Australia, France, and many others. So where did this nonsense gain traction? Well, it was started by a dubious character named Andrew Kaufman, who pretends to be qualified in biology from prestigious MIT, but he isn't. He just isn't. That's simply a lie that he tells to try and give himself credibility. He's actually a twice struck off GP, struck off for stealing from patients in South Carolina and later struck off again in Ohio. He then went on to be a failing psychiatrist in New York before becoming a grifter on the internet. Here are the details of him being struck off in South Carolina. Cause: Dr. Kaufman participated in a research project that offered participants a $25 gift code to Amazon.com as an incentive. After the study concluded, Dr. Kaufman used nearly all the remaining gift codes, which had been purchased with unrestricted grant money from a pharmaceutical company, to purchase personal items. As a result of his actions, Dr. Kaufman was suspended from the residency program and notified that his status would be listed as a non-program completion, which caused his resident training license to become inactive. You see, Kaufman lied and told the alt media that the virus had never been isolated. Strangely, when he was doing this, he used the actual paper that showed the first isolation of the virus. This one. It's even in the title of the paper, and if you go to my website, you'll see identification of coronavirus isolated from a patient in Korea with COVID-19. His grift is very similar to many of the cons on the internet. It relies on people simply not reading his evidence and just believing him due to his credentials, which you may remember are completely fake. You see, firstly, he claimed that the virus hadn't been shown to exist. Now, this isn't complicated, it's just a lie. It's a bald-faced lie. He then went on to explain, and remember, he isn't qualified and doesn't know the first thing about any of this, that by culturing the virus on a cell, it contaminated it. This is just flat-out bullshit. He is literally hoping no one understands the process of how viruses are discovered. He also claimed that no control was used in the experiment. This was also a lie. See the control here. And if you go to my website, you'll see SARS-CoV-2 inoculating cells against a control batch of cells that show no reaction. Yeah, but has it passed Koch's postulates? Christ. He then later went on to say that further proof that this isolated virus was fake was the fact that the Korean paper stated that the virus hadn't gone through Koch's postulates. Kaufman seized on this as some sort of smoking gun and repeated it to the alt media, who repeated it en masse. Koch's postulates, simply put, is where you isolate a virus and infect an animal with it. Then you allow that animal to infect another animal from which you extract and isolate the same virus. This proves that the virus is transmissible, and it can also prove the harmful effects of the virus. Now, to be fair, the Korea paper, the original paper where they isolated the virus, did say that they hadn't fulfilled Koch's postulates. They simply didn't have the time to put it through an animal. Case closed then, that's it. Well, no. Because shortly after that, another laboratory did transfect it through a series of macaque monkeys. See here. And on my website, it shows the paper Comparative Pathogenesis of COVID-19, MERS and SARS in a non-human primate model. And in this paper, you can also see the results of the infection on the cells here, and basically what it shows is the shattered glass effect on the monkey's lungs. Following that, hundreds of labs across the globe also transfected their own animals. So this idea that the virus has either never been isolated or passed through Koch's postulates simply isn't true. It's a lie, and anyone who repeats it is either a liar, a poor researcher, or grossly misinformed. On my website, there's another example of a monkey paper called Age-Related Rhesus Macaque Models of COVID-19. So what are these Koch's postulates that people keep raging about, and have they been fulfilled? Well, the viron must be present in every case of the disease. Yes, they have done this. They have identified the genome and they have a test for it. The viron must be isolated from the host with the disease and grown in pure culture. Yes, we have done this. This is the thing that Andrew Kaufman claims contaminates the virus because he's a liar. The specific disease must be reproduced when a pure culture of the viron is inoculated into a healthy, susceptible host. Yes, they've done this with monkeys and various other animals. The viron must be recoverable from the experimentally infected host. Yes, this has also been done. They were able to extract it from a second monkey infected by the first monkey. the bullshit. So what did Kaufman think was happening? And remember, he is a liar and a total fraud who deceives people about his credentials, and he is making shit up. So you will be forgiven if you notice that his theory doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. Well, he said that he'd looked at the work of one Dr. Hildreth, who had previously made the claim, the virus is fully an exosome in every sense of the word. Not SARS-CoV-2, mind, he was talking about HIV. But as I said, this is all nonsense and bullshit from Kaufman. Anyway, with this quote in mind, Kaufman decided that viruses don't exist, and that all viruses are, in fact, exosomes. An exosome is a cell in the body that is used to communicate between other cells. They aren't viruses. So how did he come to this conclusion? Well, he saw a picture of some exosomes and he thought, crikey, that looks a little bit similar to SARS-CoV-2, sort of, if you squint. Now, here's where everything collapses. Kaufman obviously just Googled exosomes and found a picture. He then went on with his claims. The main problem is that he totally misidentified what he was looking at. He was looking at an Epstein-Barr virus. You see, he saw exosomes which look like tiny dots coming out of the virus, forming a ring around a cell in the center. SARS-CoV-2 is a coronavirus, so it has a corona or a ring of spikes around it. And he mistook the exosomes leaving the Epstein-Barr virus for the ring on SARS-CoV-2. The fact that he uses a picture of a virus to try and convince you that viruses don't exist and are misidentified exosomes should be your first indication that he is full of shit. Also, I feel that it is very important to understand that you don't identify viruses by looking at them under a microscope. You identify their unique genome. And if you go to my website, you can see the mistake that Kaufman made, where he mistook exosomes for the corona ring on SARS-CoV-2. Later, he compounded himself even further by not understanding what SARS-CoV-2 actually looks like either. In the picture below, which on my website shows a picture of SARS-CoV-2, he thought that the virus was the outside bits attacking a human cell. He didn't realize that the whole thing is SARS-CoV-2. He doesn't know what he's fucking talking about. Finally, the source of his theory publicly refuted him. Hildreth was a doctor that was part of early studies into HIV and AIDS. When Hildreth stated that the virus is fully an exosome in every sense of the word, he was talking about HIV and how it uses a Trojan horse mechanism to remain hidden from the immune system. It was nothing to do with SARS-CoV-2, which at that time hadn't been discovered. Hildreth had this to say about Kaufman's theory. The virus is real, the pandemic is real, and it's caused by the virus, period. He then went on to tweet, apparently some are citing my work on HIV and exosomes to claim I dismissed the COVID-19 virus as a serious threat. Here is the paper, and as you can read for yourself, I do no such thing. COVID-19 is a totally different virus and is a serious threat. And that's from James E. Hildreth, who Andrew Kaufman stole his stupid theory from. Kaufman claimed that exosomes and COVID-19 are indistinguishable, but if you actually look at the true measurements for viruses and for exosomes, it's just stuff that he made up and no one bothered to check. And if you go to my website, you can actually look and you can see the comparison that Kaufman made and then the true comparison between exosomes and viruses. So, to sum up, he is of poor character, having stolen from patients and been struck off twice. He lied about his qualifications. He has never done any lab work at all, especially no work with viruses. He didn't identify a virus, but used the picture of this virus to try and say viruses don't exist. He misidentified the SARS-CoV-2 virus as a human cell. He thought COVID-19 was called that because there were 18 previous ones. Yes, he really did that. It's on film. He misunderstood the main point of the theory from which he derived his own theory. He has cited precisely zero evidence to support his assertions, and he continuously lies about the contents of paper. He trusts that his gullible followers won't check. But the alt media loved this guy, and this allowed him to grift even more money from vulnerable and injudicious people. He set up a medical type advice service where, for a mere $1,000 an hour, you can chat to him over Skype, and he will tell you how to rid your body of exosomes. Now, if that sounds like utter made-up shit that can't be done, that's because it is. It's made-up shit that can't be done. I actually emailed him and I said that I had COVID. Should I go to the hospital? And he advised, no, pay him $1,000. And in just 3 weeks, he would have an hour's Skype with me to sort it all out. This type of advice, as well as being greedy, is at best irresponsible and at worst willfully dangerous. And if you go to my website, you can see the price range for his fabulous service where he will Skype call you and tell you how to get rid of your exosomes, which is not a thing that can be done. But do viruses exist at all? One of the most surprising notions to emerge at the start of the pandemic was the idea that perhaps viruses, those things that have been ubiquitous in our lives, those things that you've all had at one point in your life, that those things didn't actually exist. Now, this was sold by its proponents as deep research flying in the face of established mainstream dogma. In retrospect, I'm not sure that this is accurate. The mind does strange things in times of stress. I'm not saying it's definitely this, but it might well be this. A virus happened, the future was uncertain, and people were anxious. Would this affect their lives? Would they get ill? Would they know people who would die? Would they be forced to have medicine that they didn't want? Would the supermarkets close so they couldn't get food? Would their jobs be at risk? All of this was, at the time, a possibility, and the human mind does not deal with uncertainty very well. So, subconsciouses everywhere went into a frenzy of mental gymnastics, and some people convinced themselves that viruses don't exist because some bloke on the internet said so. Why? Well, if viruses don't exist, then SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist, and therefore there is no uncertainty and nothing to be worried about. You can just get on with your life. This is called blinkering yourself, and it's an attempt to avoid scary reality. Now, I'm not saying it's definitely that, but yeah, it's probably that, isn't it? You see, the idea was floated that viruses and germ theory itself was flawed. Had someone noticed a flaw in the over 150 years of experiments showing how viruses and germs work? No. Had someone repeated the rabies experiments and noticed something amiss? No. Had someone demonstrated that the normal accepted laws of virology or even germs had been shown not to work on all occasions? No. Now, what happened, right, is that someone put a quote on the internet. I'm sorry if that sounds really glib and dismissive, but that is exactly what happened. You see, Louis Pasteur was the founder of what is known as germ theory, his experiments proving how viruses work and leading to the invention of vaccines, antibiotics, a greater understanding of disease and the ways that hygiene and medicine can treat or prevent the onset of many diseases. He pioneered the understanding of how killing germs can avert disease, which led to greater understanding of sanitation, public health, and much of modern medicine. In opposition to this was the idea put about by Claude Bernard and later developed by Antoine Béchamp called terrain theory. Now, this posited that the body or terrain was everything, and the idea states that germs or microbes are insignificant or non-existent, and that illness is caused by the body itself. The idea being that a healthy body could repel all disease regardless of what it was exposed to. So a quote popped up on the internet, apparently from an obscure French text. The quote was apparently from Pasteur, taken on his deathbed. The dynamite passage was, "Béchamp was right. The pathogen is nothing. The terrain is everything." And sometimes this quote is written as, "Bernard was right. The pathogen is nothing. The terrain is everything." And sometimes pathogen is replaced with microbe. So why the discrepancy over who was mentioned and what exactly they said? Well, that's because the quote is completely fabricated. It's made up. It doesn't even appear in the book that it's claimed to be from, or anywhere other than the internet. The quote isn't real. Furthermore, who gives a flying shit what Pasteur said? That's not how things work, is it? If Carl Benz had said on his deathbed, you know, cars don't exist, would that mean that your family runaround would suddenly vanish? Of course it wouldn't. Now, if you have a healthy body, keep in shape and maintain your terrain. Is this going to be beneficial? Of course, but that's simply not how it works. The healthiest person is not impervious to certain diseases and pathogens. No one is invincible. I don't give a shit if you're Jeff Capes or what. The plague will fuck you up. And that's it. That's all the evidence that some people needed to abandon 150 years of known medical fact. A single made-up quote on the internet. That really isn't how things work. You need to disprove or show the inadequacies the current established understanding has first, which is difficult because it's based on verifiable, repeatable knowns. And then you need to explain why your system is a better explanation, and then you need to show and prove this with verifiable, repeatable demonstrations of this. None of this was done. But it isn't even a HSID. As the pandemic spread, the UK government announced SARS-CoV-2 was to be taken off the HSID list. A HSID is a high-consequence infectious disease. This was seen by elements of the alt media as a smoking gun. Some even tried an ill-advised attempt to prosecute the UK government based on the fact that SARS-CoV-2 was no longer a HSID. The spurious and frankly stupid lawsuit was based on the fact that this had been done in secret, despite the fact that this was actually published on the government's website and therefore was not a secret at all. So, why did the alt media think that this was significant? Were they just clutching at straws? Well, yes, basically. The alt media, for some reason, despite having never heard the phrase HSID before, were convinced that if it's not a HSID, then it's nothing to worry about at all, as if there are only two categories of disease in the world, high consequence and of absolutely no consequence. Now here's the list of HSIDs taken from the government website. If you can think of a disease not listed here that you definitely wouldn't want because it could kill you, congratulations, you've debunked this silly notion. HSIDs are Argentine hemorrhagic fever, Bolivian hemorrhagic fever, Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, Ebola virus, Lassa fever, Lujo virus disease, Marburg virus disease, and severe fever with thrombocytopenia symptoms. Airborne HSIDs are Andes virus, avian influenza A H7N9 and H5N1, avian influenza A H5N6 and H7N7, MERS, monkeypox, Nipah virus infection, pneumonic plague, and severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS. So if you can think of a disease that I haven't just mentioned that you wouldn't want, congratulations, you've proven that this is of no significance at all. Well, I'll help you out. Typhoid, typhus, or HIV are not HSIDs. Anyone fancy any of those? Right? Think just because they aren't on this list that they aren't problematic for the sufferers, particularly if left untreated? Right, so why isn't SARS-CoV-2 considered a HSID? Well, if we actually look at the definition of a HSID, we can see that on 2 counts, SARS-CoV-2 does not meet the requirements to be included. You see, SARS-CoV-2 has a fatality rate of about 2%, so not a high death rate when compared to, say, Ebola, which is a HSID and has a death rate of 50% or more. Also, we have a test for SARS-CoV-2. In fact, we have several, so it isn't difficult to detect. Hence, it can't be a HSID. It's really as simple as that, and not significant at all. In the UK, a high consequence infectious disease is defined according to the following criteria. Acute infectious disease? Yes. Typically has a high case fatality rate? No. May not have effective prophylaxis or treatment? Yes. Often difficult to recognize and detect rapidly? No. Ability to spread in the community and within healthcare systems? Yes. Requires an enhanced individual population and system response to ensure it's managed effectively? Yes. So because two of those aren't met, it's not a HSID. It's as simple as that. The best way to explain what this actually means is to use a football analogy. Imagine your body is a Sunday League football team. Well, next week you're playing Ebola, and they will definitely beat you 50-0. Hard times. But this week you're playing COVID. COVID will probably beat you 2-0. So the defeat will be less crushing, but it still looks likely that you will lose. For comparison, flu is a team that you expect to beat 3-0. So think of SARS-CoV-2 as a second flight team. They still have the ability to beat your amateur side given the chance. But they're faking the death certificates. Professor Chris Whitty, the government advisor, announced in April 2020 that all deaths that were believed to be SARS-CoV-2 related would be recorded as such, even if they didn't have a test. The alt media jumped on this as proof beyond all doubt that the UK government were massaging the figures. The theory was that they had been artificially inflating the numbers so that the populace would be scared into lockdown. You see, the alt media has been convinced that the lockdown was the main point, ignoring the fact that the UK only really had 3 weeks of serious lockdown before everyone just started ignoring it. And this is expanded on in my herd immunity article, which is available on my website. It transpired that their fears about the death figures were also unfounded. Not only that, but the alt media grabbed the completely wrong end of the stick and began beating wildly around the bush with it. This was a fundamental misunderstanding about how deaths are recorded and why tracking suspected deaths would be a good idea. There are two running metrics for recording the deaths from SARS-CoV-2, an IO7-1 and an IO7-2. And on my website, it shows the guidelines for coding COVID-19 for mortality. An IO7-1 means that COVID-19 virus was identified. An IO7-2 means that COVID virus was not identified, but was probable or suspected. So what does this mean? It means that the criteria to be included in the daily death toll, the ones shown on the news, are quite strict. In order to be an IO7-1, you have to die in a hospital or care home with a positive test. This is the figure that the government was announcing on the news. But the final say always goes to a doctor observing the death. But they died with it, not of it. But what about the comorbidities? Isn't that people dying with it and not from it? Again, this shows a lack of understanding about how SARS-CoV-2 works. It suppresses your immune system so that you have no natural defense. If you have something like diabetes, which your immune system was coping with, take that immune system away, and suddenly the condition that you were living with could become deadly. So most people will actually die from a comorbidity, one that otherwise would not have been a threat. If you have no comorbidities, but SARS-CoV-2 develops into COVID-19, then your immune system starts attacking itself. And this usually results in your lungs filling with a fluid containing blood clots and later organ failure. So all this with or from stuff just shows a complete lack of understanding of the facts. On my website, there's a definitions of COVID-19 deaths between different sources, and it shows that the DHCS and the ONS register deaths from COVID-19 in a different way. The most complete and most accurate is the death certificates that have been checked over to see that COVID-19 is actually the main cause of death. And if you go onto the ONS website, you'll see that this is actually the highest figure. The figure that the government show is the lowest possible figure. An IO7-2 is suspected SARS-CoV-2 but with no proof, and this is vital because it allows for the collection of data about how the virus spreads, who it affects, etc. But without a positive test, they will be added to the IO7-2 list. So this raises the question, if the government are trying to scare us, why would they use the lowest possible number of deaths. If they wanted to frighten us for some reason, they would include all the suspected deaths too. For example, in India, the current death toll is about 500,000 from SARS-CoV-2, which is a tragedy. However, if you look at the excess deaths for the year, they stand at around 4 million. So that this means 4 million people died in India, more than were expected to in 2020. Most of these died in rural areas. Anecdotal evidence points to respiratory distress, so probably this pandemic that's all the rage. But because these people never received a test, they will never be added to the figures. The current world figures for deaths by SARS-CoV-2 is 4 million. Records from India suggest that the total should be at least double. The best indicator that takes into account all the problems caused by the pandemic and the reaction to the pandemic is to use excess deaths as a measure. India had about 4 million excess deaths in 2020. The United States had about 300,000 excess deaths, and the UK had about 90,000. That's how many people more died that year than was to be expected. What I want to reiterate is that there are actually three ways of recording deaths in the UK. IO71, IO72, and then I checked. IO71 is died in a hospital setting or a care home setting within 28 days of a positive test, and that's running about 150,000 at the minute. The IO72 is suspected, so no test, but they suspect that COVID is involved, and that's actually running at about 160,000 at the minute. The highest number is those where somebody has checked the death certificate, looked over the actual details of the death, and decided whether or not COVID was actually a contributing factor to the death, meaning that if this person hadn't have caught COVID, they would still be alive. That figure is running around 176,000 at the minute, which again raises the question, why is the government not using that figure, the highest figure, if the whole point is to scare us? But Carrie Mullis said, there are two quotes being peddled that apparently show that the inventor of the PCR test, Carrie Mullis, felt that they were not suitable for indicating the presence of a virus. Unfortunately, neither of these quotes actually say this. In fact, both of the real quotes used to say that the PCR cannot detect viruses actually say the complete opposite. There was a different iteration of the first quote, but it wasn't real. Yet again, certain people within the sphere of the alt media simply lied and fabricated a quote. This quote was, "You cannot use this test to prove infectious ideology or to diagnose an infectious disease." Who made this quote up? Well, you'll never guess. It was those bastions of honesty, Thomas Cowan and Andrew Kaufman. The real quote probably isn't from Mullis either. It's from an article written by a bloke called John Lauritsen about HIV. And the quote is, "Quantitative PCR is an oxymoron. PCR is intended to identify substances qualitatively, but by its very nature is unsuited for estimating numbers. Although there is a common misimpression that the viral load tests actually count the number of viruses in the blood, these tests cannot detect free infectious viruses at all. They can only detect proteins that are believed, in some cases wrongly, to be unique to HIV. The tests can detect genetic sequences of viruses, but not viruses themselves." So, it's saying that the PCR test can detect the presence of a virus, but not immediately tell you how much virus is present or the state of its progression. But you will note that it definitely says that it can detect the virus, contrary to the lies being spread. The second quote is also taken wildly out of context. It's often spread as this: "With PCR, if you can do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody." Yet again, this is a fabrication, while all the lies from the truth movement. The real quote is this: "Someone with HIV generally is going to have almost anything that you can test for. If you have it, there's a good chance you've also got a lot of other ones," Mullis said. So, to test for that one and say that has any special meaning is what I think is the problem, not that PCR has been misused. He said, If they could find this virus at all with PCR, if you could do it well, you can find almost anything in anybody. It starts making you believe in the Buddhist notion that everything is contained in everything else. The context is vital. You see, Mullis agreed with Peter Duisberg of the House of Numbers film fame. They felt that AIDS was not connected to HIV, and that only homosexuals could catch it. Duisberg also believed that AIDS was a consequence of the gay lifestyle, punishment, if you will, for sinful behaviour. Mullis wrote the foreword in Duisberg's book in which this theory was promoted. And AIDS denialism seems to be a thing amongst certain downplayers of the COVID crisis who spread these misconceptions in order to draw an audience, get clicks, and make money. And on my website, there's an article from the Sun newspaper in 1989, written by one Dr. Vernon Coleman, in which he describes AIDS as the hoax of the century. Straight love fears suited prudes, gays and businesses. Straight sex cannot give you AIDS, he says. This turned out not to be true. Mullis also made no money for his invention of the PCR test. The literally billions it made was swallowed up by the company that he worked for when he invented the device, and Mullis saw very little financial compensation for his efforts. So, you can imagine his frustration when his device, stolen from him, was being used to diagnose HIV, which he didn't think was a significant disease, and certainly he didn't think was the cause of AIDS. The first problem is that he and Duisberg were flat out wrong. HIV is the cause of AIDS. So when he made the second quote, he was trying to explain how HIV is found uniformly in AIDS patients when he believes that they are not connected. Hence, he is speaking figuratively. Oh, you can find anything. That's why the HIV's there. Now, this obviously isn't true. It's what's called a figure of speech. If it were true, then no one would ever be found innocent by DNA. They'd just keep dialing it up until they found your DNA at the scene of the crime. But this isn't what happens. If you seriously think that you can find anything just by dialing up the number of amplifications, then do it. Go nuts. Find dodo DNA in a house brick. Just keep dialing it up until you hit it. Put simply, something needs to actually be there in the first place in order for you to amplify it. One question that those who spread this misunderstanding can't explain is why, if the PCR test is not suitable for detecting viruses, then why, oh why, did Kary Mullis specifically state in the patent for the device that this was exactly what they were designed to do? The patent said, various infectious diseases can be diagnosed in presence in clinical samples of specific DNA sequences characteristics of the causative microorganism. These include bacteria such as Salmonella, Chlamydia, and Neisseria viruses such as the hepatitis virus, and parasites such as Plasmodium responsible for malaria. Furthermore, what the hell do you think the PCR is actually used for if not this? Again though, let's imagine that Mullis did say that this device is useful. Again though, let's imagine that Mullis did say that this device is useless. Who the hell cares? He also said that he regularly chatted to a man-sized glow-in-the-dark raccoon from outer space that spoke perfect English. You see, PCR has been used in a vast amount of areas for the last 35 years. Strangely, people never had a doubt about its uses when it was detecting HIV or chlamydia, or being used to match DNA for organ transplants, or even when used to determine the parentage of children. Christ, someone's going to have to call Maury Povich and explain that all those people who were determined to be the father, well they aren't. But it's only looking for genetic material. Some say, oh, but it's not looking for a virus, it's looking for genetic material. And this is either disingenuous or a genuine misunderstanding of what they're saying. This use of the phrase genetic material implies that it's looking for any old shit. Genetic material refers specifically to DNA or RNA. Viruses are RNA, and like all DNA or RNA, they have a unique genetic code. It's the code that is the indicator of the virus. So when people say, oh, it's just genetic material, that's as silly as saying, was there any evidence that this young girl was raped? No, I'm afraid not. None at all. Oh, except for another person's DNA in her vagina. Is that any good as evidence? But asymptomatic spread is a myth. For some unknown reason, the alternative media suddenly decided that they had never heard of the concept of asymptomatic spread, or even that such a thing was completely new. They appear to have completely forgotten or not heard of Typhoid Mary or Mary Mallon, the unfortunate woman who asymptomatically spread typhoid to approximately 50 people during her work as a cook in the early 1900s. HIV is also mostly spread asymptomatically, often without even the knowledge of the infected until symptoms present themselves much later. Chlamydia, tuberculosis, cholera, and various other diseases can be spread asymptomatically. A third of flu cases are spread asymptomatically. I mean, just think about it sensibly for a second. Do you always know the source of your illness, particularly in winter when everyone's catching bugs? In fact, asymptomatic spread is what allows certain diseases to transmit freely. In June 2020, Maria van Kerkhove, who works for the World Health Organization as a technical lead, stated that asymptomatic transmission was very rare. And people jumped at this seeming smoking gun, demolishing the fear and propaganda. Shortly after making these statements, Maria van Kerkhove said that people had misunderstood her and that she'd been talking about the difference between asymptomatic and presymptomatic. Presymptomatic is a person who was not ill at the beginning but later became ill. In this context, she meant asymptomatic as people who never show symptoms at all. Add to this that she was talking about a small subset of data and the confusion ran rife. She was referring to a small study that did show that the people studied who were asymptomatic didn't seem to spread the virus as much. However, this is not indicative of worldwide trends. She later clarified that her statement was wrongly interpreted. Basically, this is what happens when you have scientists talking about very specific things to a group of journalists looking for a headline. The truth gets lost in the middle. She said, I was responding to a question at the press conference. I wasn't stating a policy of the WHO or anything like that. I was just trying to articulate what we know, she said on a live Q&A streamed across multiple social media platforms. And in that, I used the phrase very rare, and I think that's the misunderstanding, to state that asymptomatic transmission globally is very rare. I was referring to a small subset of studies. Some people cite a study taken directly from Wuhan, the origin point of SARS-CoV-2, which apparently tested 10 million people and discovered not one case of asymptomatic spread. Except that's not what the study said at all. The study said that asymptomatic spread is definitely real, but that symptomatic people spread the virus more easily, which again is basic common sense. Others will cite a study where an asymptomatic carrier was introduced to about 600 people, and lo and behold, none of them caught it from this guy. Surely that proves that asymptomatic spread isn't possible at all. Yeah? No, not even close. What it shows is that single guy who had SARS-CoV-2 didn't have enough viral load to spread it. That's all it shows, nothing else. But masks don't help. In fact, masks are dangerous. In 2020, when masks were advised to help reduce the transmission of SARS-CoV-2, again, the alt media saw a nefarious plot. Many within the scene started worrying that masks could actually kill the wearer by depriving them of precious oxygen. If a thin layer of cloth can render a person unconscious, why have I been wasting my good money on chloroform? The idea that masks could actually cause hypoxia, low levels of oxygen in your blood, became very popular in the alt media. Personally, I racked my brains looking for examples of highwaymen lying dead at the side of the road, tales of ninjas dropping dead en masse from trees halfway through their missions, or the regular bloodbaths that occur in nail bars when the staff all suffocate. And then I recalled, That's simply not a thing that happens, is it? So where did this anti-mask thing start? Well, colour me surprised, but it began in March 2020 and came indirectly from the UK government. In March 2020, before the first lockdown started, the PR firm Topham Guerin was given a no-bid £3 million contract, which was paid for by the taxpayer, to provide an information campaign for the UK public. What was the purpose of the campaign? Well, part of it was encouraging people not to wear masks. The campaign was called Enjoy Summer Safely, and it was tied into the Eat Out to Help Out campaign, and it spread the rumours communicated by the government that masks were not required, were ineffective, and could even cause the spreading of the disease. Also rubbish about masks trapping the disease and all that other rubbish, and this was later expanded to include nonsense about masks causing hypoxia, etc. Why? Well, because the government were trying to achieve herd immunity, which they believed would be quicker and cheaper than dealing with the actual problems faced by SARS-CoV-2. See my herd immunity article. By herd immunity, basically they mean doing sod all. The argument presented by the alt media was based around two completely contradictory ideas. One, that masks don't stop the virus, and two, that masks keep the virus in your mask, giving you a massive dose. Oh, and yeah, and they also suffocate you as well, apparently. Okay, the first one has an element of truth. You see, the virus particle is actually smaller than the gaps in the fabric of the masks. Case closed then. No. You see, the virus doesn't travel on its own. It requires a water droplet or a spit particle to attach itself to in order to spread. These water droplets are bigger than the gaps in the masks, so they can't pass through. It's common sense, really. Let's have a spitting contest. We can both stand in front of one another and we have to spit in each other's face. But when it's your turn to gob at me, you have to wear a mask covering your mouth and nose. So who do you think is going to come out of that covered completely in phlegm? Also, if the virus is held inside the mask, then it's come from you. It's already inside you. You aren't wallowing in a pool of the stuff. Also, you really should only use a mask once before washing it. But what about the writing on the side of the box? Even that says that masks are not effective in stopping you from getting SARS-CoV-2. Ha ha ha! Case closed, surely. And then on my website, there's the picture that's doing the rounds of a box of masks, and it says, will not provide any protection against COVID or other viruses or contaminants on the side of the box. This is because the mask is to prevent the wearer unknowingly infecting others. It isn't to protect the wearer, it's a measure designed to prevent the spread of the disease. It's kind of like wearing a seatbelt in the seat behind the passenger in a car. The chances of you getting hurt are lower than the chances of you crushing the front seat passenger to death, hence you wear a seatbelt. Masks are simply one tool of prevention. Are they an impenetrable barrier? No. But to all those that say, why bother with masks and social distancing and washing your hands? Yeah, why bother with a speed limit? We already have seat belts and crumple zones and tests. Some people cite the almost mythical Danish study, which apparently showed that wearing masks was pointless. Except, you've guessed it, it didn't say anything of the sort. The authors of the study actually tried to address this misinformation, saying categorically that the paper did not say that masks were useless. The paper wasn't even testing the protective or preventative qualities of masks, and yet it concluded that masks should be worn as part of a wider range of preventative methods. The study did acknowledge that masks do not offer much, if any, protection to the user, and that masks alone would not be effective, but we know this already. No one has ever tried to argue that point. Masks are simply one type of preventative method. Some even argue that no study has ever shown that masks work in any way at slowing the spread of disease. This is, of course, complete bollocks that relies on some rather slippery data mining and the use of quotes taken out of context. Who would have thought? Anyway, there has been recently produced a meta-study named The Impact of Community Masking on COVID-19, a cluster randomized trial in Bangladesh. Can you believe that it showed without a doubt that masks help stop the spread of a virus spread by people's breath. And if you go to my website, you can actually read this study for yourself. But Michael Yeadon said they give out 90% false positives. Yeah, he also said in September of 2020 that the pandemic was over. He said in August of 2020, there's pretty much no risk anywhere. He said in September of 2020, cases are never ill. He said in October of 2020, the public health emergency arising from COVID-19 has ended permanently. And he said in January of 2021, it's over. Michael Yeadon is erroneously touted as the ex-vice president of Pfizer because apparently being connected to Big Pharma is only bad if they disagree with your premise. He wasn't, though. He was a specialist in allergies that sold his department for a huge profit. He has never, ever worked with viruses and admits to have never, ever done a PCR test. For some reason, people listen to this man's opinion. So he claimed that the PCR tests give out 90% false positives. This ridiculous assertion from a man who has no knowledge of what he speaks about can be disproven with simple common sense. If the tests give 90% false positives, then we would see 90% positive rate everywhere, the same amount of infection everywhere we tested. Just the fact that some places have 0 cases shows that this is made up. That would be impossible if 9 out of 10 come back positive. It's absolute bullshit. So how did he get this figure? Well, by lying, basically. He noted that the ONS said that 1% of the population was infected with COVID, but he noticed that testing centres, more than 1% of the people who went there were coming back positive. As this was higher than the national average, he deduced that 90% of them must be false positives. Now, if you think that sounds like total bollocks, you're correct. Of course, there will be cases where people potentially feeling ill will go to be tested, and more than 1% will be positive, because you're dealing with a sample rather than the total. In fact, to go and get a PCR test, you had to be exhibiting symptoms and at the time have a positive lateral flow test. So it's likely that the people going to get tested might have the disease. Now, Michael Yeadon is not stupid, so he must realise that he's lying. He currently runs a group called PCR Claims with Patrick Fagan of the MI6-sponsored mind control program Cambridge Analytica. Again, people are ignoring this because he's telling them exactly what they want to hear. The only problem is he's been proven wrong on every single occasion. But they use too many cycles in the UK. Various members of the alt media shared a picture taken from an NHS document that seems to imply that the UK PCR tests use 45 cycles, which is a high number, to amplify the RNA from viruses. This trope ties in with the previous misconception that you can find literally anything with the PCR test if you dial it high enough. The document was from May 2020, and it's from the NHS and the PHE explaining the protocols for testing should any private labs want to do testing for them. And on my website, there's a link to that paper and the page that people are talking about, and it does say 45 cycles. However, this was not the point at which the test was determined to be positive. This was the point where they shut the machine off. It just simply came down to a misreading of the document. Cycles is the number of times that the machine whirs round. CT count is the place where they take the test. Now, luckily for us, this sort of thing is actually monitored. People have made a point that if it's higher than 35 CTs, then it can't be accurate. Luckily for us, we have an average of 25.5 CT, and this is all collated by the ONS. If you go to our website, you can see the data showing this. Again, though, this shows a distinct lack of understanding about quite a specialist subject, and it's a mystery as to why all of a sudden everyone decided that they were experts on the subject and could spot flaws. There is an excellent article which explains the details and nuances on PCR testing far better than I ever could, and it's linked on my website. But what about the FOIA requests to show the isolated virus? So some of you have seen the FOIA request asking various places to hand over documents pertaining to the isolation of SARS-CoV-2. The response is being peddled as proof that the virus has never been properly identified. This FOIA request has gone to the PHE in the UK, the FDA in the USA, and the National Research Council in Canada. Now here's the thing. An FOIA request is for information or data that has been previously hidden or withheld. The genome and the isolated SARS-CoV-2 virus is in the public domain. So an FOIA request is pointless. You may as well go and petition your local Burger King. As shocked as some of you may be, this request was also not quite as honest as it seemed at first. The request asks to see the isolated virus, but they used the different usages of the word isolated to trick people into thinking that such a request could not be fulfilled as the virus didn't exist. But their request couldn't be fulfilled as they requested because it was impossible. You see, they used the common usage of the term isolated, meaning alone, completely alone, not the scientific usage of the term, which means to culture the virus to prove its existence. As they state in the request, we want it in the everyday sense of the word. Now here's the disingenuous trick. You can't photograph a virus on its own. It needs a host to exist. Viruses are inert without a host cell. They need a host cell to exist. But that wouldn't be isolated in the common usage, so it's simply a silly word game. Isolation is done by extracting the virus from a patient, culturing the virus on other cells before spinning it down to reveal the genome. What they are asking for is impossible. It's like saying that you want a picture of a cloud, but with no oxygen or sky surrounding it, just on its own. Or that they want to hear music, but it can't come from a person, an instrument, a speaker, or a device. They just want to hear an example of music coming out of thin air. Crafty fuckers. This is the sort of disingenuous trick that only serves to detract from serious investigation and tars everyone as those who don't check details. So one wonders why they actually did this. If you go to my website, you can see an explanation of the process of isolation and the FOIA letter that's been sent around. This is from the letter that's in circulation. All records in the possession, custody or control of Public Health England describing the isolation of a SARS-CoV-2 virus directly from a sample taken from a diseased patient where the patient sample was not first combined with any other source of genetic material, i.e. kidney cells, aka Vero cells. This, as the authors of the letters know, is how you isolate a new virus, or any virus, by culturing it on cells to see the reaction before filtering it and isolating the virus. They're implying that by mixing it up with the monkey kidneys, you get a sort of broth from which who knows what might emerge. But that's extremely disingenuous too. They know that monkey kidney tissue is often used to cultivate viruses. This doesn't matter because they know the genome of the kidney, so when they take that out, they know that what is left is the RNA of the virus. It's the same principle as extracting DNA from another person's body or from an animal. They don't mix up the two. And we know that the authors of the letter know this distinction in the language because of the next sentence, which totally contradicts the previous sentence. They say, please note, I am using isolation in the everyday sense of the word, the act of separating a thing from everything else. I am not requesting records where isolation of SARS-CoV-2 refers to the culturing of something or the performance of an amplification test, i.e. a PCR test, or the sequencing of something. Crafty sods. They don't want the cultured virus. They want the everyday sense of the word, the cloud without oxygen surrounding it, the music out of thin air. Which raises the question, why would they do this? This hasn't happened by mistake. They've taken time and effort to craft a deceitful request and then portray it as something that it isn't. Just to clarify, their argument is that if you can't produce music without a speaker or device, then Black Sabbath never existed. It really is as fucking stupid as that. Now, the PHE did actually send a detailed report on how to isolate the virus. I'll bet none of the recipients have actually read it. Specifically, in the section titled Isolation of Infectious Virus from Respiratory Samples, detailing them isolating the virus, specifically to see how infectious different samples are. And it also has links in the reference to other times that the virus was isolated. So the PHE did actually send them examples of the isolated virus in their response. On my website, you can see the paper that the PHE sent as response, and you can see the section Isolation of Infectious Virus from Respiratory Samples in it. But this won't be enough for some, as they want the virus in nothing, the cloud not surrounded by oxygen, the music from nothing. Well, that isn't possible. But what we do have is an electron microscope picture of the virus isolate. Now this is when the virus has been identified directly from a patient, in this case lung fluid, and is identified without the need to culture the virus on other cells. So a picture does exist, and as I mentioned before, such a sample is called an isolate. And if you go to my website, you can follow the link and you can see that isolate extracted from lung fluid. If you need to lie and trick people in such a sleazy way, your evidence obviously isn't that strong. So, to clarify, an FOIA request would get you nowhere with a public domain document, and what they are asking for isn't to determine if the virus has been identified or not, it's simply a crappy word trick. Also, if you see the response from the DHCS that for some reason, who knows why, people have chosen not to share, it says at the bottom, your request has been handled under the Freedom of Information Act. The DHSC does not hold the information that you requested. This is because we are not the appropriate authority to contact on the subject. However, you may wish to contact Governor Office for Science, which do hold the information relevant to your request, and then they provide the contact details. And if you go to my website, you can see a tweet where somebody has shown the bottom of this letter that all the people touting the FOI request, for some reason, decided to crop off the bottom of their response. But it's just the flu. People saying it's just the flu. Again, this is really simple. No, it isn't. Would that it were so. SARS-CoV-2 has a death rate about 10 times that of the flu and a contagion rate about 20 times. Simply by looking at the numbers, you can see that this is at best wishful thinking and at worst a total refusal to accept the facts. You see, flu on average kills about 15,000 people a year in the UK, and in 2020, by March, there had been just shy of 8,000 flu deaths recorded by the PHE in the UK. Flu season also ends in March, which is just about when people started dying from COVID. SARS-CoV-2 killed 140,000 people in 2020, so if they simply swapped the flu over, where the hell did all those extra deaths come from? Excess deaths were 90,000 by the end of 2020. Some say, but the symptoms, will nobody think of the symptoms? Yes, very good. Some symptoms are similar. Some. It's because it's a respiratory disease, but never has the flu caused the blood clot-filled pneumonic fluid. Never has flu caused the shattered glass damage to the lungs. Never has flu caused such damage to organs or to the immune system. And never has flu caused the neurological problems we see associated with SARS-CoV-2. Yes, they both have symptoms of a cough and a high temperature, but to say that they are the same is like swearing blind that an omelette is a cake because both contain eggs. Ironically, at the beginning of the pandemic, the COVID denial crowd used the flu figures to suggest that SARS-CoV-2 was nothing to be worried about, and later they pretended that they hadn't done this. And if you go to my website, there's a graph from factsforeu.org who showed that at the time there were 8,937 deaths with coronavirus, which was nothing because flu deaths in 2017 and 2018 were 26,408. In 2016 to 17 were 18,009. In 2015 to 16 were 11,875. And in 2014 to 15 were 28,330, which is an average of 15,000 a year. You can then see the table from the PHE that shows that just shy of 8,000 people have died of flu already by March in 2020. But It has a 99.9% survival rate. Even the CDC said so. Okay, put simply, no, they didn't. That's not true. There is a screenshot that has been shared quite a lot, and if you go to my website, you can see it. It's got CDC written on the top, and it says infection fatality rate and survival rate. It infers that the CDC made this prediction, even implying that this particular screenshot is from the CDC's own website. It's not. Sorry to spoil it for you. It's not. It's not real. So, did the CDC make this statement? No, they didn't. Would you believe that the figures used have been taken out of context? Here's the paper in which similar figures appear. And basically, if you go to my website, it's called Predicted COVID-19 Fatality Rates Based on Age, Sex, Comorbidities and Health System Capacity from cgdev.org. It's a working paper, making guesses and estimates about scenarios playing out in a number of hypothetical ways. Basically, it's like well, we think if this happens, then hopefully this will happen sort of paper. So the figures presented, what are they? Well, it was an estimate of potential IFR in very specific circumstances. Simply put, IFR is kind of saying your chances of catching it and dying, whereas CFR, case rate fatality, is how likely you are to die if you definitely already have the disease. You see, the CDC has never released a survival rate. The survival rate differs dependent on a number of factors. Mainly, it's how much resources are available to treat people, which is exacerbated by high levels of infection. The galling thing is that this is completely controllable. See my herd immunity article. So, this 99.9% is the hope that in certain circumstances, they might be able to get the IFR, the infection fatality rate, down to this rate. Spoilers, they didn't manage it. And though a paper was also released from Stockholm University in July 2020, that was also a prediction. And if you go to my website, you can actually see the screenshot, and it basically says the same thing, a 99.99% survival rate. Unfortunately, Sweden did particularly badly, probably because they also seemed to pursue herd immunity. These ideas, particularly the fake CDC screenshot, was spread by the political group the Irish Freedom Party. At the time that they spread these lies, the CFR in Ireland was 6%, and at the same time, June 2020, the US also had a case fatality rate of 6%. At the time they spread this lie, Sweden had a CFR of 12%, the UK had a CFR of 14%, and France was approaching 20%. And if you go to my website, there's various graphs indicating the number of deaths in each country per million citizens. But the ONS said the survival rate was 99.9%. Yet again, no, they didn't. But what about this graph I've seen on the internet? And if you go to my website, you'll see a very similar graph, basically claiming 99.9% from the ONS. Can you believe that this wasn't taken from the ONS? It was fabricated with data taken from the ONS. Well, surely that's as good, isn't it? No. You see, what they've done here is to plot the number of deaths against the entire population of that age range to make the death seem artificially low. I ask again, why are all these lies circulating the truth movement? The message is misleading. You see, the average for the entire country cannot be used to calculate an individual's chance of dying from the virus. The ONS, like the CDC, does not publish a survival rate because it doesn't work like that. What they do is track the percentage of deaths against the number of cases. And this has fluctuated due to all sorts of factors. Principally, that it was far more difficult to treat at the beginning of the pandemic, and that deaths increased when hospitals are stretched for resources, which again is common sense. Now, is the virus more likely to affect older people than those with underlying health problems? Yes. But this somewhat misses the point. The infection leads to others being infected, and there is also the possibility of organ or neurological damage from long COVID. Recovered means that you didn't die. it doesn't necessarily mean that you're totally fine. The UK has seen 9,000 children hospitalised with SARS-CoV-2 and numerous examples of children spreading the disease to adults who have sadly died. In the USA, more children have died from SARS-CoV-2 than normally die from the flu. In Utah this year, there have been 800 children hospitalized, 100 of them suffered multi-system inflammatory syndrome, which affects the organs and heart. But the death rate for 2020 is the same as 2003. This isn't how you measure death. You need to look at how many people were expected to die. The death rate should drop progressively as time passes. Medicine and living standards improve, and as they do, life expectancy increases. In the 60s, for example, the average age of death in the USA was 69, and it's now 79. In the UK in 1960, it was 71, and now it is 81. So, by looking at a year like 2003 and seeing that we have a similar death rate in 2020, it doesn't mean that this year wasn't bad. It means quite the opposite. It means that we have gone backwards 20 years in 12 months. The death rate in 2003 was the expected death rate. The death rate in 2020 was much higher than expected. And if you go to my website, you can see the fluctuating mortality rates in year by year in England and Wales. And you can also see an article about how life expectancy in England has actually fallen due to COVID. But the ASMR is the same as 2008. Age standardized mortality rate is a way to take into account the changing demographics of a country, specifically the ages of a population. As life expectancy improves, then you get an older population. However, a population with more elderly than young people would expect to see more deaths through old age and natural causes. Therefore, sometimes ASMR is used to make comparisons. You may have seen this table before, and there's a graph floating around that's in pink and blue that shows the ASMR from 1943 steadily dropping all the way down to 2020, and then there's a sharp rise which shows that it's the same as 2008. The table shows that before 2008, the ASMR was higher than 2020. In fact, there are only 13 years that 2020 was higher than. Case closed, surely now, eh? No, sorry. You may notice another trend in this graph. Generally, the graph is sloping down to the right. What this shows is that as time passes and medicine and hygiene improve, the average life expectancy increases. So similarly to the death rate compared to 2003, this actually shows that we've destroyed years of progress in a few months. But there was no excess death this year. Or, but, not that many died. That's just a flat out lie. Excess deaths at the end of 2020 were over 90,000 people in the UK and 300,000 people in the USA. Excess deaths is how many people more than expected died. In England and Wales, 608,002 people died. As we can see in graphs, that's the highest number of dead people in the UK since the First World War. And if you go to my website, there's a graph indicating this. In fact, we can look at the excess deaths for various countries, and we can see that the majority recorded excess deaths for the year 2020. If you go to my website, there's a graph showing excess deaths for the majority of countries on the planet. The figures below are actually 2020 and up to September 2021. The countries where the excess deaths listed are higher than the number of COVID deaths probably indicates unreported or untested COVID deaths. Again, this puts paid to the theory that deaths were being exaggerated or artificially inflated. Death was never and has never been the main problem with SARS-CoV-2. It's the contagion. For every bed taken up by a SARS-CoV-2 patient, there are 2 beds used as an exclusion zone that can't be used by anybody else. We only have a finite amount of beds. The more SARS-CoV-2 patients, the more beds need to be used as part of a widening exclusion zone. Very soon, we run out of beds and then no one can be treated for anything. But the lockdown killed more people than COVID. Now, nobody likes lockdown, no one. But when talking about a disease that spreads via person-to-person contact, limiting that contact is a bit of a no-brainer. It has been shown in numerous cases that lockdowns, if done correctly, can reduce transmission. And if you go to my website, there's a graph showing the fall in transmission when the first lockdown was introduced in the UK. Are they much fun? Absolutely not, no. Do they cause all sorts of other problems? Absolutely yes, they do. The problem was that in the UK, we resisted a lockdown for 4 weeks, never closed the airports to incoming passengers, had limited testing and limited PPE. This was combined with the fact that after 3 weeks, the government's own spokesman, Dominic Cummings, knackered everything by undermining government policy in public. Please read my herd immunity article for a broader explanation. But one of the notions put around as fact in order to leverage bad feeling against the idea of lockdown as a measure was the idea that they had actually caused a spike in the suicide of lonely, isolated and scared people. Some estimates were as high as a 600% increase. Like so many things spread recently, this turned out not to be true. Suicides actually fell during lockdown, contrary to what the alt media said. The tragedy is that yes, mental health problems do exist, yes, people are isolated and lonely, and yes, a lockdown will exacerbate these problems. But here's the thing, those problems existed years ago, and will probably always exist, and until the lockdown, most of you didn't give a shit about those people. It's almost as if people are using other people's suffering as leverage for their own complaints. It's almost as if some people are using the plight of others so that their whinging about minor inconveniences doesn't seem quite so self-centered. If that's not you, prove me wrong. Continue to look out for your fellow man. If you're angry with that last statement, well, perhaps I just hit a nerve. The idea that the lockdown killed more than the virus came from the UK HM Treasury, specifically via the think tank Economic Insight. Why? Well, the Treasury just didn't want the economy to slow down, so they made this statement. It's not backed by facts or evidence, it was just manipulative propaganda based on money. Similar notions were pushed by the Great Barrington Declaration, which came from the think tank AEIR, which is essentially financed by the fossil fuel industry. You see, oil went negative for the first time ever in early 2020 due to the lack of international and domestic travel. It doesn't take a genius to understand why the oil industry might push the idea that not travelling is actually extremely harmful. It isn't due to concerns about public health. The first anti-lockdown protests were organised by the Heritage Foundation, which is again the fossil fuel industry. The idea to film the empty hospitals was also put about by members of the CNP. You'll never guess which fossil-based industry they're keen on. It's the fuel industry. Is any of this starting to make sense yet? You see, the promotion of doctors taken up by the alt media as bastions of the truth, such as Sunitra Gupta, Carol Sikora, Carl Hennigan, Martin Kulldorff, Jay Bhattacharya, and Michael Yeadon. These people are actually being pushed by the UK government's nudge unit, which is the mind control team, and this is all being done via the think tank Surgru Communications. Sunita Gupta herself is actually financed by donors to the UK government. On the 9th of April 2021, Open Democracy reported that Oxford University professor Sunita Gupta, a critic of public health measures to curb COVID-19 and a proponent of natural herd immunity, had received almost £90,000 from the George and Emily von Opel Foundation. The foundation was named after its founder, George von Opel, who is the great-great-grandson of Adam Opel, founder of the German car manufacturer. George von Opel is a Conservative Party donor with a net worth of $2 billion. Gupta's arguments against lockdowns and in favour of herd immunity, the report further noted, have found favour in the British government. What can we conclude from this? We have what is called a false premise fallacy. This means that many of the assumptions of the alt media and their conclusions are based on erroneous ideas. If the initial premise is incorrect, the conclusions and theories drawn from this are also incorrect. What you should do is alter your position as new information comes to light. The alt media has not changed its position since February 2020. SARS-CoV-2 has become to some in the alt media as Donald Trump became to CNN. They basically said that he embodied everything that they hated, but frankly, he was the only thing that kept them relevant. When Trump went, CNN's ratings plummeted. Perhaps this explains why some have clung to these easily debunked notions for so long. Regardless of the reasons, these tropes aren't true. What is the point of a truth movement if you just pick and choose what to believe because it supports your preconceived narrative? Furthermore, these misconceptions have allowed the alt media to play directly into the government's hands. Unbeknownst to them, they are actually part of the government's plan to avoid scrutiny and blame. Put extremely simply, you can't hold the government to account for allowing the deaths of 150,000 people from a virus if a large amount of the populace believes that the virus isn't serious or doesn't exist. The alt media have been duped into being pawns in a disinformation campaign, and the irony is that ultimately they will probably be blamed for the consequences. People will forget the politicians and just focus on the conspiracy theorists that told people not to take preventative measures and to pretend that the virus isn't real. In times of universal deceit, telling the truth becomes a revolutionary act.